My name is Amy, and I'm a passenger on the midnight train. The train has reached another destination, and against my resolutions, I went outside again. Now, before you call me stupid, let me explain. I had a reason. We arrived at the town early in the morning. I literally didn't care, since I wasn't going to risk my life again like that. Lily, on the other hand, insisted on going out and didn't care about the fact that she'd almost died last time. I guess you just crave fresh air after being stuck here for several years. She promised to be back by noon, and I spent my time with the weeping bride. I talked to her about Lily, about the dark beast, and the man with the briefcase, and how someone had tried to kill me. I still don't know who was responsible because there was not a single clue and there hadn't been any incident since. To be honest, my money was on the man with the briefcase, mostly because of his convenient timing and his tendency to feed the train. Noon came and went, and I waited in my compartment, but Lily didn't return. I got nervous, but I waited a few more hours because maybe she'd just forgotten the time. About mid-afternoon, the panic began to set in. Something was wrong. That's when I went to look for the detective. Finding him was no problem. I explained the situation to him and asked what concerned me the most. What would happen if she didn't return to the train in time? The conductor collects them if they don't come back, he explained. Doesn't bring them back alive, though. They're sacrifices for the train. You see my reason now? I jumped up and proclaimed I'd go out and find her. I had no way of knowing what would await me outside, but I didn't think about it either. My worries for Lily were overriding my brain. Maybe I was becoming familiar with the midnight train, and familiarity did indeed breed recklessness. The detective looked at me with disapproval. That's suicide, kid. I can't let her die, I replied harshly. Why don't you come with me? It's safer together. He shook his head. Your girlfriend is not my problem, kid, he said, and took a drag from his cigarette. But you care about me. What makes you think that? He looked at me with utter indifference. My stomach dropped. I'd made a mistake again. I had applied human standards to something that was not at all human. Had relied on the assumption that he liked me just as I liked him. In fact, my life didn't matter to him at all. Of course it didn't. Then why did you help me? I asked. He shrugged. It's not like I had anything better to do. I understood that it was one thing to take me back to my compartment after I had gotten injured or to look after an unconscious friend for a while, but a whole other to go out with me and get in actual danger. The whole realization hurt more than it should have. I didn't waste any more time with him, rather hurried towards the door and headed out. The conductor stood next to the door, just like last time, and I turned to him. Mr. Conductor, what are the laws of this town? I asked. He shook his head. There are no laws, ma'am. I was not sure if that was good or a very bad sign. When will the train depart? At midnight, of course. I thanked him, checked the time, and hoped that 8 hours would suffice to save my girlfriend as I hurried toward the town. Dark clouds hung deep on the sky and faded to fog that obscured the streets. I couldn't see much of the town, but it was obviously not as worn down as the last one. Beautiful Gothic architecture was visible through the pale white. The buildings were tall and made of dark stone. I hurried through the narrowed streets, not entirely sure what I was looking for. A person, maybe whom I could ask about Lily. It didn't take long until I saw the outline of a person through the fog. They seemed to be a child, since they were much shorter than I was, and very thin. "Hello?" I asked as I approached the silhouette. "Excuse me." But as soon as I reached the shadow, it disappeared. I thought that it must have been an optical illusion, a reflection in the fog, but I couldn't help but shiver. I felt like I was being watched. There was another shadow just a few minutes later, and just as I reached it, it vanished again, only to reappear a few meters further away. Not a single soul was around. I suddenly felt vulnerable out in the open like this. The street grew tighter, as if the walls were closing in. The fog whited out my vision almost entirely. Something was approaching me from behind. I could basically feel its eyes burning on the back of my head. I've never wielded a weapon in my entire life, and I've never had the desire to do so, but at that moment, I desperately wished for a gun. I sprinted forward and hoped I could outrun whatever was following me. The memory of my encounter with the dark beast lingered in my mind and made the non-existing wound on my stomach sting. A growl as of a wild animal echoed through the streets, and I spun around and raised my hand to shield my body from the expected impact. Bloodshot eyes stared at me from mere centimeters away. I screamed in terror and stumbled backwards as the fog closed in around me, suffocating the whole world in white. "What do you want here, stranger?" a bodiless voice asked. I couldn't determine where it came from. It echoed all around me. "I'm looking for my girlfriend, Lily." The fog around me finally lifted. I was no longer in the streets of the town. I stood in the middle of a dimly lit hallway. Specks of blood littered the vinyl floor. The tiles on the wall were covered in dirt and grime, and light barely pierced through the dirty windows. "Entertain me," the child voice demanded. I looked around, searching for the source of the voice, but seeing nothing. "I just want my girlfriend, please," I pleaded. "I'll leave you alone after this." The voice giggled. "Find her, and I'll let you go." I knew there were still a few hours left until midnight, yet I felt like time was running out already. There was no use arguing with the voice, so I scrambled all my remaining bravery together and ran. I had no clue where I was, where I had to go, or how dangerous this place actually was, but I had no choice now. Do you know the thrill you feel on a roller coaster, strapped into the seat as the wagon slowly gains speed? When you know there's no going back now. Imagine that, but 1,000 times worse. That's how I felt at that moment. The building revealed itself to be a hospital soon enough. Wheelchairs stood in the dimly lit hallways. The air smelled faintly of chemicals. I screamed Lily's name, but there was no response. In retrospect, running around screaming in a hellscape like this was probably not the best idea, but I was in a hurry and had no idea where to even start looking. The voice had disappeared entirely, and the hospital was silent. My own voice, that repeated Lily's name over and over again, was the only noise I heard for a while as I traversed a seemingly endless hallway. For several minutes I wondered if I would ever reach a stairway or anything, because it seemed like I was passing by the same rooms over and over again, trapped in a never-ending spiral. I wished for a weapon again. Without warning, a pained scream pierced through the silence, and I froze in shock, raising my arms in a reflex to protect my head, but nothing attacked me. I looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, and found one of the doors on the right side slightly ajar, a deviation from the never-changing hallway. The voice was male, but there was no sign of Lily, and I didn't know how else to continue, so I pushed the door open and entered the hospital room. The room was just as dirty as the hallways, illuminated only by flickering light bulbs. All beds except one were empty. Blankets and pillows stained with blood and sweat and dirt, All sorts of medical equipment stood vacant beside them. In one bed lay a person, a man that screamed his lungs out. Bandages were wrapped around his head. Over his eyes, he was missing a hand and a leg. A dark patch of blood formed right over his stomach. His bed was just as dirty as the others, and so were his clothes and the bandages. "Sir," I spoke hesitantly. "No." He turned his head to look at me, but he couldn't see, of course. "Please, not any more. No more medicine. Please, I'm fine. I swear to God, I'm fine. You cured me. I'm fine. I can go home. Don't waste any more medicine on me. Please, I swear." "Sir, please." I tried to interrupt his panicked tirade. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Oh, of course not. You're right. Everything you did was so right. Of course, my eyes were a problem. It was right to take them out," he reassured me, violently sobbing now. "Your treatment was perfect. I'm fine. Just let me go home now. Please, please." "I'm not a doctor. I don't even work here, sir. I'm just a visitor, and I'm looking for my girlfriend." "A visitor?" he repeated, and his sobs slowly faded. "You should consult with the doctor then. She is such a competent woman. She treated me, and now I'm healthy again. Maybe she can treat you too." "You screamed in pain," I whispered. "No," he denied immediately, his voice trembling with panic. "I'm fine. I'm perfectly fine." I choked back tears. My first priority was to get Lily and myself out of there. But I pitied the man. I knew that even if I chose to save him now, if I somehow got him out of his bed, he wouldn't survive. The blood patch on his abdomen grew larger by the minute, and even if he didn't die of blood loss, the wounds would most likely be infected. The man was begging for his life, albeit in a weird way, but he was dead, and I wanted to cry for him. "I'm so sorry," I managed to say before I turned around and left the room again. Silent tears rolled down my face as soon as I was back in the hallway. The monotony returned once more. "Voice?" I asked after more minutes of walking down the never-ending hallway. "Voice, are you still there?" "Stranger?" the child asked. I knew the voice was evil, just another monster I had to face in this nightmare journey, and yet it was comforting to have someone to talk to, someone that seemed almost sane at least. What was that? It laughed. My entertainment. I wiped my tears away. "That's cruel." "So?" it replied angrily. "They did cruel things to me. I return the favor now." "What happened to you? Who are you?" There was no reply. The hallway reached a sudden end. A stairway led downwards, and I finally felt like I made some progress in my suicidal endeavor. As I descended the stairs, I regretted my decision to leave the train. I walked as far down as I could, pushed a dirty white door open, and reached a new hallway. It was broader than the first one, and a sign that hung from the ceiling said, "Operation Rooms." I silently prayed that Lily wasn't here. I walked slowly, looking inside every room and finding each of them dark and empty, except for one in the middle, the one with number 6 that was brightly lit. I hesitated, yet I knew I had to check just in case Lily was in there. I pushed the door open and was met with hot, humid air and the stench of rotting flesh that stuck in my throat and made it hard to breathe. Beyond a glass wall was the operating table. A man lay there, surrounded by 3 doctors, who didn't wear any sterile clothes or gloves. "Mr. Donovan," a tall man exclaimed, "came here because of severe pain in his abdomen. Dr. Blaine, how should we treat him?" The woman with curly blonde hair answered, "Removing his liver seems appropriate." The small man nodded. Indeed, appropriate. May I suggest to remove his left arm in the process? Indeed, the tall man agreed. Do you agree to remove half of his lung? Of course, said the small man. What about his toes? He doesn't need his toes, right? The woman giggled. The tall man nodded and lifted a blood-stained scalpel from the desk close to him. Let's start with his intestine. He pressed the blade onto the stomach of the man on the table and made a large cut, drawing a lot of blood in the process. The man, who was apparently fully conscious, screamed in pain and tried to move, but his limbs were tied to the table with metal chains. How annoying, the small man said. The woman giggled again. Don't worry, she replied, yarn and a large needle in her hand. I'll take care of it. That was when I finally managed to turn away from the gruesome show. The man screamed with pain and terror. The air felt like tar in my lungs. I stumbled out of the hall again and bent over, coughing and crying. I didn't vomit, but I felt very, very nauseous. Voice! I screamed, but it sounded weak. Why are you doing this? Answer me! They did this to me. The voice was right in front of me this time. I looked up and saw a child, frail and sickly and very young. I couldn't determine their gender. They had long white hair, only one eye that was dark and brown. Their skin was grayish and covered in scars, especially the head. It looked like someone had tried to cut their skull open several times. Voice? Stranger, they replied. Do you have a name? No. The voice was left of me now, and I turned to see another child that looked exactly the same. Some sort of ghost projection, I figured. No name, for I wasn't born. Not really born, another projection, ripped from my mother's corpse. Not alive, not dead either. I turned around again and again, trying to keep track of the illusions. They were all around me now, mirrors of the same child over and over again. Not screaming, they continued, dreaming, thinking. The voices merged into one, creating. I don't understand. I wrapped my arms around myself, scared of the frail child. The illusions now faded into one, and they showed a crooked smile. Entertain me, they said once more, or I'll keep you around, stranger. They faded for good, and I wasted no time. As fast as I could, I ran down the hallway, hoping for another set of stairs that would lead me to Lily. I was still screaming her name, but there was no answer. Someone grabbed my arm, and I screamed. I spun around, raising my free hand to defend myself, although I had no weapon, and faced a dark-haired woman with a friendly face. Hello, ma'am, she said. I'm Dr. Marsh. How can I help you? I'm looking for my girlfriend Lily, about my age, red hair. Did you see her? She shook her head. Now that is not what I am talking about, she replied in a condescending tone. I am asking for wounds, diseases, chronic pains. No thanks, I'm not here for surgery. I tried to rip my arm free from her grasp, but her fingers dug even deeper into my skin. She lifted my hand closer to her face. Oh dear, discolored skin, she stated. You have a problem with your liver and your arm. It's likely to break in the future, you know. Let's cut it off before that happens, shall we? I did the only thing I could think of at that moment. I kicked her in the stomach, used her stunned surprise to rip myself free, and ran for my life. I wasn't sure what was actually going on here, but I wasn't going to let some insane doctor remove my body parts. She screamed like a banshee, but I didn't turn around. I ran until my legs hurt and I could barely breathe, and finally I reached another stairway. Without hesitation, I threw the door open and hurried downwards, one flight of stairs after the other, until I reached the lowest point. The morgue. I braced myself, took a few deep breaths, and opened the door. I expected cool air, but the morgue was just as hot as the surgery rooms. I felt like vomiting again, but I choked it back and walked through the metal tables. Rotting corpses were laying on each of them, flies already buzzing around the mold-covered flesh, but I didn't look at them. The rotting ones couldn't be Lily. I refused to believe she could be one of them. I found her at the other end of the room. She lay on one of the metal tables, unconscious but alive. "Lily!" I screamed, shaking her violently to wake her. "Lily, come on, wake up, we have to go." Her eyes fluttered open. She blinked a few times and looked at me. "Amy? Hey, what? Oh, damn. Oh, damn indeed," I replied with a nervous smile. "Come on, let's get back to the train. I have no idea how much time we have left." "You have a watch." She pointed to the small watch on my wrist. "This is a dream, dear. Some cruel child's imagination. Time works different here." "What? No." "Explain it later. Let's go." She jumped from her metal bed and took my hand. I can't tell you how relieved I was to have her by my side again. "Voice!" I screamed. "Voice! Let us go!" The illusion appeared immediately. "Don't call me Voice," the child hissed. "I don't have a name. Don't try to give me one, stranger." "I'm sorry. I found my girlfriend. Please let us go home now." They looked at me with their sole eye as I stood before them, trembling with fear-stained eyes and holding on to Lily's hand like my life depended on it. I was terrified, exhausted, and still very nauseous. A cruel smirk appeared on their lips. They waved their hand and a fog rose from the ground. "Run, Cinderella," they giggled. "It's almost midnight." In retrospect, I wonder how that monster knew the fairy tale of Cinderella. Seconds later, I stood on the street in the middle of the town again, but this time with Lily by my side. The fog had cleared a little, and I saw other people lying in the dirt around us, unconscious, dreaming. "Amy," Lily pointed at them. I shook my head. "No time for that. Run." We ran as fast as our legs could carry us, holding on to each other's hand to not get lost in the fog again. And I only looked at my watch as we arrived at the midnight train again. There was still more than 1 hour left. "Asshole," I muttered under my breath. The conductor greeted us friendly as always when we entered. I managed to smile at him, wrapped one arm around Lily's waist, and pulled her close to me. Her arm was comforting. Her warmth was comforting after all that had happened. It reminded me that this was real. She was real, and I had managed to save her. All the horror hadn't been for nothing. Just as I relaxed a little, I heard manic laughter echo through the train. Lily and I looked at each other, and she looked just as confused as I was when the voice didn't seem to fade. I turned and faced the conductor again. "Mr. Conductor, what is that noise?" I asked bluntly. He smiled, turned a little more wicked as he answered, "The midnight train has a new passenger, ma'am." Now, I don't know what will happen with this new passenger, but his laughter is keeping me awake right now. I have a bad feeling, but that's kind of normal for everything related to the midnight train. Right now, I'm just glad I can sleep with Lily next to me. I'm afraid of the nightmares that are likely to plague me for a long time after this. But I'm alive. We are both alive, and that's all that matters right now. I will keep you guys updated on the situation with the new passenger, and to be honest, I'm afraid said updates will come rather soon. Until then, don't get lost in the fog. You never know where you might end up.